They say Whistle Bend is where stories go to die. A dusty, sun-bleached purgatory where dreams get stuck in the mud and good men get buried with their secrets. I used to believe that. I was 23 years old, and the only things I believed in were things that could bleed, break, or burn. My name is Willa Boone, and in a town that had forgotten its own soul, I was about to find out that some stories don't die. They just wait. It all started the way trouble usually does in Whistle Bend, with a simple chore on a Tuesday afternoon. The girl who normally took the marshal his coffee, Clara May, had taken a tumble off a porch step. A twisted ankle, she said. Looking back, I wonder if it was the step that tripped her, or the fear. "You're not afraid of the marshal, are you, Willa?" May Traz, the boarding house owner, asked me. She tied her apron so tight it looked like a shield. I shook my head, but the truth was, I couldn't afford to be afraid of anyone. Fear was a luxury, and I was deep in debt. So there I was, standing outside his door. Marshal Silas McCrae, the man they called the blind lawman. They only ever whispered it, of course. They said a Confederate bullet had stolen his sight during the war, leaving him with nothing but darkness and a will made of iron. He lived in the last room on the east wing, a ghost in his own house. I knocked twice, hard enough to be heard, soft enough not to be a challenge. The voice that came back was like gravel and bourbon. "Doors open." I stepped inside and the world seemed to dim. The air was thick with the smell of saddle soap, old leather, and gun oil. He was sitting by the window, his back to me, his face turned toward a sunset he couldn't see. His hat was off, and his forearms were scarred like the bark of an old oak tree. The silence in that room was heavier than a coffin. He didn't turn around, but he spoke, and his voice cut right through me. "You're not Clara." "No, sir," I said, my own voice barely a whisper. She turned her ankle. "I'm Willa." He just tilted his head, listening. Not to me, but to the space around me, to the weight of my footsteps, to the air I was displacing. It was unnerving. "You walk light," he said, a statement, not a question. "Lighter than most." The words caught in my throat. I told him I was raised around horses, that you learn to step careful or you get kicked into next week. A low sound rumbled in his chest, almost a chuckle. "That'll teach you," he said. "Set the tray on the desk." I did, my hands steadier than I thought they'd be. The tin cup rattled just a little. "You wash clothes?" he asked. I told him I did, mostly scrubbing the blood out of shirts from men who'd lost at cards or love. He made that sound again, that ghost of a laugh. "You speak plain," he said. I told him I didn't see the point in dressing up ugly truths. Then I apologized. "Don't beg," he said, his voice firm. "Not in this town. You either owe or you don't." And then there was this silence, not an empty one, but a heavy one, the kind that settles when two people realize they're done pretending. My mother, a Cherokee woman who whispered secrets to the river, used to say that folks who can't see with their eyes learn to hear with their hearts. He must have heard something in my silence, because his next question hit me like a physical blow. "She Cherokee?" he asked. No one in Whistle Bend had ever dared to ask me that to my face. I stood there frozen. The whole town knew what I was, the half-breed girl with a dead father's debts. But they never said the word. It was a brand they'd burned on my soul, but they were too cowardly to speak its name. "Yes," I finally managed to say. He gave a slow, single nod. "Explains the silence in your steps," he said, "and the truth in your voice." He turned his head then, not quite at me, but near me. His eyes were pale gray like a river shrouded in fog. They looked through me, past me, into something I couldn't see. "What if I told you," he said, his voice dropping low, "that I see more now than I ever did with sight?" I should have been scared. I should have run. But I heard myself say, "I'd say you're either a liar or a poet." A small, crooked smile touched his lips. "Sometimes they're the same thing." He was quiet for a long time, and I could feel him weighing something in his mind. Then so softly I almost missed it, he asked, "Will you come again?" I asked him what for. He tapped a worn, leather-bound book on the table beside him. "To read," he said. "I tire of my own thoughts." Every instinct screamed at me to say no. I had laundry to scrub, a life to survive. But something in that room in that moment held me captive. It was the pride in his voice and the wound beneath it. "All right," I said. And as I turned to leave, hand on the doorknob, I heard him say my name, almost to himself. Willa Boone. That's a name I won't forget. And I knew right then that a story hadn't died in Whistleben. A new one, a dangerous one, had just begun. The next evening, the heat sat on Whistleben like a fat, lazy hound. The air was thick and smelled of dust, and things left too long in the sun. I walked back to Silas McCrae's room with a book tucked under my arm. It was my mother's, filled with old tales of wolves that loved the moon and rivers that ran backward. I didn't know why I'd brought it. Maybe I just needed to hold on to something that felt like home. I knocked and his voice called me in. He was already by the window, waiting. The lamp was lit, casting long, dancing shadows that made the room feel alive. A train whistled in the distance, a lonely sound that made my own bones ache with the urge to run. He didn't have to ask if it was me. He just knew. "You came, Yarani," he said. I told him he'd asked. He gave me that crooked half smile. "I've asked plenty," he said. "Doesn't mean I'm used to folks listening." I sat down and opened the book. My voice was shaky at first, a nervous bird taking flight. But as I read, the story filled the room. It wasn't just words on a page anymore. It was a spell. I could feel Silas leaning into it, listening with an intensity that was almost frightening. He wasn't just hearing the story, he was living it. When I paused to catch my breath, he said, "You read like you mean it." "I guess I do," I told him. "Stories were the only inheritance my mother left me." "Not many folks here bother with stories," he said. I shot back. "Not many folks here bother with truth either." That shut us both up for a minute. The wind picked up outside, rattling the window pane like a restless spirit. "I used to believe in straight lines," he said suddenly, his voice low and far away. "Justice, order, the war, it wrung all that out of me." He told me about the last thing he ever saw, a man's face close enough to kiss, with a knife in his hand, and the world going dark. He didn't think he'd been blinded. Not at first. He just thought it was blood in his eyes. Turns out it was everything leaving him all at once. His voice didn't waver, but I could feel the tremor in the air. "And you stayed in the law," I said, amazed. He leaned back. "When the world kicks you out one door, you either crawl back or you build a new one." He turned his head, his blind eyes seeming to search the darkness of the room. "This place," he said, "it doesn't need a lawman. It needs someone to remind folks that decency ain't dead yet, even if it limps." Just then, a sharp, impatient knock shattered the quiet. Silas stiffened instantly. "Stay seated," he ordered in a low whisper. The door creaked open, and Deputy Harlan Ross swaggered in. He was tall, sunburned, and carried himself with the cheap arrogance of a man who's only ever tasted borrowed power. "Evening, Marshal," Harlan drawled. "Got word there's a stranger snooping round South Ridge. Claims he's looking for someone." Harlan paused for dramatic effect, his eyes flicking over to me with a smug little grin. "Someone named Boone." My blood ran cold. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Silas didn't move a muscle, but the stillness in him was terrifying. "Did he give a first name?" Silas asked, his voice dangerously level. Harlan shook his head. "No, sir, but he's mean-looking. Got one gold tooth and a limp like he's owed pain by the ground he walks on. My father. My father ran with men like that. Men who didn't die honest deaths. Men who left behind ghosts and debts." Silas turned his head slowly in my direction. "Willa?" he said, and the way he said my name made it sound like a verdict. "You got folk out there that might be looking for you?" I could barely breathe. "I don't know," I lied, the words tasting like ash. "My daddy. He ran with a bad crowd." Harlan snorted. "Ain't no surprise. Half this town's got blood in its family tree. Some of it's still wet." Silas's voice was like the crack of a whip. "Watch your tone, deputy." The authority in his voice was absolute. Harlan mumbled an apology and backed out of the room like a scolded dog. The moment the door clicked shut, Silas leaned forward, the lamplight carving deep shadows into his face. "You're not safe out there alone," he said. I gave a bitter laugh. I never was. He asked if I had a place to sleep, and I told him not if May Traz heard about outlaws sniffing around her boarding house. He was quiet for a long, long time. The only sound was the frantic beating of my own heart. Then he said, "There's a cot in the storage room down the hall. It's dusty, but it's clean. Lock the door behind you." I looked at him, stunned. "You trust me?" I asked. His answer came back, swift and certain. "No," he said, "but I don't trust the men who might be hunting you a hell of a lot less." I left before he could say another word, but as I locked myself in that dusty little room, I knew the story had changed again. This wasn't just about reading books anymore. This was about survival. And I was beginning to wonder if the blind lawman wasn't just protecting me. I was beginning to wonder if he was the most dangerous man in Whistleban. The next day, the town itself seemed sick with anticipation. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down, making sane men irritable and nervous horses shy. I spent the morning with my hands raw from lye soap, scrubbing other people's sins out of their clothes, but my mind was 1,000 miles away. It was stuck in that dim room with Silas McCrae, and with the ghost Harlan had summoned, a man with a gold tooth and a painful limp. A man from my father's past, a past I had spent my entire life trying to outrun. Around noon, I slipped into the boarding house kitchen for a drink of water. The place was empty, the heat having driven everyone into the shadows. As I leaned against the sink, trying to catch my breath, I heard it. A slow, heavy footstep on the porch. A drag. A scrape. The sound of a man who was owed pain by the ground he walked on. I ducked behind the thin lace curtain, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Through the gap, I saw him. He was tall, wrapped in a long duster coat, despite the blistering heat. His beard was streaked with gray, and when he smiled at Mrs. Trass, a single gold tooth flashed in the gloom. It was him. He had found me. He didn't ask for a room. He didn't ask for food. He just ordered a whiskey, and when Mrs. Trass handed it to him with a trembling hand, his voice, like cracked leather and dried blood, filled the small space. "Tell me," he said, his eyes scanning the room, "when Willa Boone gets back." He downed the whiskey in one gulp, slammed the glass on the counter, and walked out. He didn't see me, but he knew I was there. I could feel his presence like a brand on my skin. I waited until the sound of his limping footsteps faded, and then I ran. I didn't go back to the laundry. I didn't go back to my room. I went to the stables. I found Silas's old horse, Gospel, swatting flies in the shade. The horse looked at me with weary, knowing eyes. I sat on a hay bale, the dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light, and I waited. He came near sundown, his silver-headed cane tapping a soft, steady rhythm against the wooden planks. "You weren't at supper," he said. His voice was calm, but I could hear the tension coiled beneath it. "Didn't feel like eating," I replied. He came closer and Gospel snorted, shifting his weight. "He found you," Silas stated. It wasn't a question. I nodded, even though he couldn't see it. "I saw him. He asked for me by name." Silas took a long, slow breath and let it out. "You're going to have to tell me who he is, Willa." And so I did. I told him the name I hadn't spoken in 10 years, Eldon Pike. I told him how my father rode with him, a gang of prospectors and claim jumpers who got greedy during the gold rush. I told him about the sheriff who was shot in the back and how Pike blamed everyone but himself. And I told him how my father vanished shortly after, leaving my mother and me with nothing but his name, a name that was a curse. Silas listened without a word, his head tilted back as if searching for answers in the darkening sky. When I finished, the silence was absolute. "You should run," he said finally, his voice flat. "Get on a horse and don't look back." I looked at him, standing there in the fading light, the outline of the lawman, the protector. "You're the marshal," I said, a challenge in my voice. He gave a bitter, humorless smile. "A blind marshal, one man, a badge can't stop a devil who rides for revenge." That's when I knew. I knew running wasn't an option, not anymore. "You don't have to stop him," I said, my voice gaining strength. "You just have to listen." I reached into my satchel, my fingers closing around the one thing my father had left me that wasn't a debt. It was a small, worn leather journal. I had kept it hidden for years, a toxic inheritance I was too afraid to read and too scared to destroy. I handed it to him. His fingers, calloused and strong, brushed against mine as he took it. He handled it with a strange reverence, as if he could feel the weight of the secrets inside. He opened the cover, and to my astonishment, he didn't ask me to read it. His thumb traced the first line of faded ink, his brow furrowed in concentration. "If they find this," he read aloud, his voice a low growl, "I'm already dead." My jaw dropped. He could read it. He wasn't just tracing the letters. He was reading them. But how? Was he lying about being blind? Was this whole thing a test? A trap? My mind reeled with 100 different questions, 100 different fears. Who was this man? This blind lawman who could read the words of the dead? He looked up then, his foggy eyes seeming to stare right into my soul. "This book, Willa," he said, his voice grave. "It doesn't just name Pike. It names them all, and it tells where the gold is buried." He handed it back to me, his face a mask of stone. "Meet me at the jailhouse tomorrow morning," he said, "and if the law won't hold him, I will." But when I got to the jailhouse the next morning, the door was hanging off one hinge, splintered and broken. The lock had been kicked in, papers were scattered across the floor like dead leaves, and the rifle rack on the wall was empty. A single perfect bullet hole starred the window pane. A cold voice from the porch made me jump. "Too late!" It was Pike. He stood there, arms crossed, that gold-toothed smile spreading across his face like a disease. "Your old man never did learn to keep his mouth shut," he sneered. Shame he passed that habit down to his daughter. I backed away, but he didn't move. He just watched me, enjoying my fear. "I ain't here to kill you, girl," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Not yet, anyway. I'm just here to collect what's mine." Before I could answer, another voice cut through the morning air, firm and deliberate. "I may not see," Silas said, stepping out from behind Pike, his hand resting on the Colt peacemaker at his hip. "But I can smell a liar from a mile away. And you, friend, reek of it." Pike spun around, his smile vanishing. "Well, I'll be," he hissed. "The blind marshal's got teeth." Just as Pike's hand twitched toward his gun, a shot rang out. But it didn't come from Silas. It came from an upstairs window. It was Deputy Harlan Ross, his face pale, holding a rifle that was shaking so hard it was a miracle he didn't shoot himself. The bullet whizzed past Pike's ear, close enough to make him dive for cover. And in the chaos that followed as Pike scrambled away and hooves thundered in the street, I realized the terrible truth. Harlan hadn't been trying to hit Pike. He'd been warning him. The gunshot echoed long after Pike had vanished. It hung in the air, a promise of more violence to come. Whistle Ben wasn't sleeping anymore. It was awake, and it was watching. The tension in the town was so thick you could have cut it with a knife, a coiled spring ready to snap. Silas paced the jailhouse porch, his cane tapping out a rhythm that matched the frantic beat of my heart. Slow, deliberate. The sound of a man counting down the seconds to a final showdown. "Your deputy," I said, the words catching in my throat. He missed on purpose. Silas stopped pacing and turned his head toward me, his face grim. "No one shakes like that unless they're hoping to miss," he confirmed. "He wasn't trying to kill Pike. He was trying to get me killed." My stomach twisted into a knot. Harlan, the smiling, smug deputy, was a snake. But whose snake was he? "So whose side is he on?" I asked. Silas's reply was chilling. "His own," he said, "like most men out here." We went inside the wrecked jailhouse and laid my father's journal on the desk. The names scrawled in my father's desperate hand weren't just ghosts anymore. They were real. They were breathing. And they were coming for me. The journal was a map of corruption. It detailed altered land deeds, gold weighed and hidden in coffins. A lawman in Santa Fe paid to look the other way. Eldon Pike wasn't the mastermind. He was just the muscle. The dirtiest hands in a very dirty game. But one line, underlined twice, made the hairs on my arms stand up. If Pike ever comes for this book, it ain't for the gold. It's for the silence. I looked at Silas. He was still, his chin tilted as if he were listening to the wind tell its own secrets. "Why didn't you shoot him?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "When you had the chance right there on the porch?" He was quiet for a long time. Because I needed the town to see him first, he finally said, to see what he is. If I'd shot him then, he'd just be another rumor, another ghost story whispered over whiskey. But now they've seen him. They've heard your name in his mouth. Now he's real, and real things, he said, turning his blind eyes towards me, can be hunted. That night I couldn't sleep. The cot in the dusty storeroom felt like a coffin. Every creak of the boarding house, every gust of wind sounded like Pike's limping gait. Just as I was drifting into a restless sleep, I heard a knock. It wasn't sharp or impatient. It was soft, hesitant. I opened the door to find Silas standing there, his hat in his hands. "I need your help," he said. His request shocked me. "With what?" He held out his arm. "Reading," he said. "Not books, people." We walked the town together that night, two ghosts moving through a town of sleeping sinners. He used me as his eyes, but he was the one who was truly seeing. Outside the saloon, he stopped. "Tell me what you see," he whispered. I described the men inside, the nervous laughter, the way they avoided saying Pike's name, but talked all around it, like a fresh grave. Silas just nodded, absorbing it all. He was mapping the town not by sight, but by its fear. At the livery, he paused again, sniffing the air. "You smell that?" he asked. I smelled hay, sweat, and cheap whiskey. "And fear," he added. "Someone's been sleeping here." We crept around back, and there in the dust beneath an awning were boot prints, one distinct dragging print, Pike's. "He's camping rough," Silas murmured. "Means he's either not planning on staying long, or he's waiting for someone." We returned to the jailhouse just before dawn. He had me read passages from the journal aloud, his fingers tracing the words as I spoke. The way he followed along was uncanny. It was as if the ink was raised, like he was reading with his fingertips. "Braille," he said when he saw my questioning look. "Learned it after. A man has to find a new way to see the world." The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The journal. My father's handwriting was messy, hurried, but certain names, certain dates, were pressed so hard into the page that the ink had left a raised impression on the other side. My God, Silas wasn't just guessing. He could feel the most important parts of the journal. He could read the secrets my father had tried to bury. "He's not just here to silence you," Silas said, his voice grim. "He's here to tie off loose ends. The other men named in this book. He's hunting them too. And you, Willa, are the last thread." "I'm not running," I said, the words feeling truer than anything I'd ever spoken. He gave me that small, sad smile. "Didn't think you would." He leaned forward, the lantern light casting his face in stark relief. "Willa," he said, his voice dropping low, "I wasn't always just a marshal. During the war, I followed orders. Orders that got good men killed. They called me a hero. But after I lost my sight, I stopped seeing uniforms and started hearing men. Really hearing them. You're the first person in years who speaks like they expect to be understood. Not pitied, not forgiven. Just heard." I stared at him, at this broken, beautiful man who saw more than anyone in this cursed town. "So what do we do?" I asked. He stood up, his posture straightening with a newfound resolve. "We give him what he wants," Silas said, a dangerous edge to his voice. "We bring him out into the open. We set a trap." "And then?" I asked, my heart pounding. He turned to face me, and for the first time, I didn't see a blind man. I saw a hunter. "And then," he said, "we bury him in the truth." Word spread through Whistle Bend like a fever. Pike was after Willa Boone. The blind marshal was standing with her, and blood was coming. The town held its breath. Doors were locked. Windows were shuttered. The whole world seemed to be waiting. We chose our ground. The middle of Main Street, right as the sun began to bleed across the horizon, painting the dusty buildings in shades of golden blood. I stood there alone, the wind whipping my hair across my face, my father's journal clutched in my hand. I was the bait. And then he came. He walked out of the long shadows of the saloon, that gold-toothed smile plastered on his face. He moved with a predator's confidence, his limp barely noticeable. "You really think a blind man and a book can stop me, girl?" he called out, his voice echoing in the unnaturally quiet street. From the door of the jailhouse, Silas stepped forward. Slow, steady. His cane tapped the ground, the only sound besides the wind. "I don't need to see you, Pike," Silas called back, his voice calm and clear as a bell. "I just need to hear the lies shake in your voice." Pike laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You ain't even a real lawman anymore. That badge on your chest is just a piece of tin." Silas nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "Then I won't get any blood on it." Pike's smile faltered. His hand twitched towards the gun at his hip. "Tell them what you did, Pike," Silas commanded. "Tell this town about the gold you stole, about the sheriff you murdered. Say my name and say hers, and tell them why you came here to silence us." Pike's face contorted with rage. "I came," he snarled, "to end what should have been buried years ago. And now," Silas's voice rang out, "it will be." The gunshot was deafening, but it wasn't Silas who fired. It was me. I had a small pistol, one I'd kept hidden for years, tucked into the waistband of my skirt. The recoil slammed my shoulder back. Pike staggered, a look of pure shock on his face. He clutched his chest, his gun falling from his hand and kicking up a cloud of dust. He looked at me, his mouth open as if to curse my name, and then he fell. He hit the ground with a heavy final thud. The silence that followed was absolute. Silas didn't move. He just stood there, his head tilted towards me. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady. "Nice aim," he said. I looked from the smoking pistol in my hand to the body lying in the street. "I had a good teacher," I replied, though I wasn't sure if I was talking about my father or about him. Suddenly, a second shot rang out. This one came from the roof of the general store. A puff of dust exploded from the ground, inches from Silas's feet. It was Harlan Ross. He hadn't been warning Pike. He'd been waiting for his moment. He was trying to clean up the mess. Before I could even scream, Silas did something impossible. He dove to the side, rolling as another shot kicked up dirt where he'd just been standing. He came up on one knee, his own Colt Peacemaker in his hand. He didn't aim. He didn't hesitate. He just fired once, twice, 3 times in the direction of the rooftop. There was a strangled cry, the sound of a rifle clattering against wood, and then the heavy thump of a body hitting the alley below. He had pinpointed Harlan's exact location based on the sound of the gunshots alone. He had taken him down without ever seeing him. The town was silent for a moment longer, and then doors started to creak open. People emerged from the shadows, their faces a mixture of fear and awe. They looked at Pike's body, then at the alley where Harlan had fallen, and then at me, the half-breed girl with a smoking gun. And finally they looked at the blind lawman, who stood unwavering in the middle of it all. He hadn't just predicted the violence, he had orchestrated it. He had used me, used Pike, used the whole town to expose the rot that had been festering just beneath the surface. And as I looked at him, I realized he wasn't just a lawman, he was a chess master, and we had all been his pieces. The sun rose on a different whistle bend. The dust had settled, but the air was still thick with the ghosts of the dead. Pike's body was gone, carted away by a grim-faced undertaker who didn't ask any questions. Harlan Ross's body was gone, too. No one spoke of it. It was as if he'd simply evaporated into the morning mist. Silas and I stood on the porch of the jailhouse. He hadn't spoken a word since the shooting. He just stood there, listening to the new silence of the town. I had expected shouts, accusations, a mob with a rope, but there was nothing. Just a quiet, unnerving watchfulness. "They won't say it," Silas said finally, his voice raspy. "But they're grateful. You did what they were too afraid to do." I looked down at my hands. They didn't feel like my own. "What happens now?" I asked. Before he could answer, a rider approached, kicking up a plume of dust. He was a stranger, dressed in the official uniform of a territorial circuit judge. He didn't dismount. He just reined in his horse, looked at Silas with cold, dismissive eyes, and held out a sealed envelope. "Marshal McCrae," the man said, his voice devoid of any emotion, "you are hereby relieved of your duties, effective immediately." He dropped the letter at Silas's feet and rode away without another word. Silas didn't bend to pick it up. He just nodded, as if he'd been expecting it. "The men my father wrote about in that journal," I said, a cold dread seeping into my bones. "They're more powerful than I thought." "Power isn't about who has the most guns, Willa," Silas said, turning his face toward the west. "It's about who controls the story. We just took their story away from them. And now they're angry." He finally bent down, his fingers finding the envelope in the dust. He didn't open it. He just tucked it into his coat pocket. "Pack your thing," he said. "We're leaving." Yeah, we didn't have much. 2 saddlebags and his old horse, Gospel. As we rode out of town, no one came to say goodbye. But I saw faces in the windows watching us go. They weren't angry. They were afraid. Afraid for us, and afraid of what would come next, now that their blind protector was gone. We rode for days, the silence between us comfortable, the shared danger a bond stronger than words. We were heading south towards New Mexico territory. Silas said he knew a man there, an old friend from the war who owed him a favor. A man who might be able to help us understand who we were up against. The man's name was Thomas Dent. We found him on a sprawling ranch that looked out over a vast, empty expanse of desert. He was older, his face a roadmap of hard years, but his eyes were sharp. He looked at Silas, and a slow smile spread across his face. He didn't shake his hand. He embraced him like a long-lost brother. "I heard what happened in Whistlebend," Thomas said after I'd been introduced. "Heard you stirred up a hornet's nest." Silas just nodded. "The hornets have a name, Monsieur Ma," he said. I handed Thomas the journal. He sat by the fire that night, reading it by the flickering light, his expression growing darker with every page he turned. When he finally looked up, his eyes were grave. "This is worse than you think," he said. "These aren't just claim jumpers and corrupt sheriffs. This is a company, the Dawson Mining Syndicate. They've got their hooks in everything from the railroads to the government in Washington. Your father, Willa. He didn't just stumble onto a gang of thieves. He stumbled onto an empire built on stolen gold and buried bodies." My blood ran cold. This was bigger than Eldon Pike, bigger than Whistlebend. This was a war. "And there's one name in here," Thomas continued, tapping a page with his finger, "that connects them all. Richard Avery. He was a Union major during the war, a quartermaster. He was supposed to be overseeing payroll shipments. But a lot of that gold never made it to the soldiers." He looked at Silas. "You remember Major Avery, don't you, Silas?" Silas went rigid. For the first time since I'd met him, I saw a flicker of something in his face, a shadow from his past. "Avery," he said, his voice a low whisper. "He was my commanding officer." The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with dizzying speed. It was all connected. Avery was the head of the snake. He was the one who ran the Dawson Syndicate. He was the one who had sent Pike. But there was more. "The last patrol I was on," Silas said, his voice strained, before I was wounded. "We were tracking a band of Confederate raiders who had supposedly stolen a Union payroll. We found their camp, but there were no Confederates. They were Union soldiers dressed as Rebs, and they were guarding crates of gold." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "I was about to send a runner back to command when we were ambushed. It wasn't a sharpshooter that took my sight, Willa. It was one of our own men. I was the only survivor. I was a loose end. They left me for dead because they thought a blind man couldn't identify them." My God. Avery hadn't just stolen the gold. He had orchestrated a massacre to cover his tracks, and he had tried to kill Silas. "He doesn't know you're alive," I breathed. Thomas shook his head. "Oh, he knows," he said grimly. "When you were appointed Marshal of Whistlebend, your name would have crossed his desk. He's been watching you, Silas, waiting. And when Willa showed up with that journal, he sent Pike to clean up both of his old messes at once." The world tilted on its axis. We weren't just fighting for my father's memory anymore. We were fighting for Silas's life. "Where is he?" Silas asked, his voice like flint. "Where is Richard Avery now?" Thomas looked at us, his face etched with worry. "He's not a soldier anymore," he said. "He's a respectable businessman, owns a bank in El Paso." The name of the city hung in the air between us, a death sentence and a destination. We knew what we had to do. We had to ride into the heart of the beast. We had to face the man who had destroyed both of our lives. We had to go to El Paso. The ride to El Paso felt like a journey into the jaws of hell. The sun was a merciless hammer, and the dust was a constant shroud. With every mile, the danger felt more real, more immediate. We weren't just two people on the run anymore. We were hunters, and we were heading straight for the apex predator. El Paso was a shock to the system. It was a sprawling, chaotic city, bursting at the seams with noise and sin. Saloons spilled drunken men into the streets, and the air was thick with the smell of cheap perfume and desperation. Men in fine suits walked with their hands near the pistols hidden beneath their coats. This was Richard Avery's kingdom. We found his bank easily enough. It was the largest building on the main street, a monument of marble and glass built to look like a temple dedicated to the god of greed. We walked in, and the noise of the city fell away, replaced by the hushed reverence of money. Men in crisp suits counted stacks of coins behind iron bars, their faces impassive. At the back of the bank, a polished oak door stood guarded by two large men who looked more like hired guns than bank guards. The plaque on the door read, "Richard Avery, President." Silas walked straight towards them, his cane tapping an authoritative rhythm on the marble floor. The guards moved to block his path. "We have an appointment with Mr. Avery," Silas said, his voice calm and commanding. One of the guards sneered. "Mr. Avery doesn't see vagrants." Before he could say more, I stepped forward, holding up my father's journal. "Tell him," I said, my voice shaking but clear, "that Willa Boone is here to discuss an old debt." The guard's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He disappeared through the oak door. A moment later he returned, his face pale. "Mr. Avery will see you now." The office was opulent. A thick Persian rug covered the floor, and the walls were lined with leather-bound books that had probably never been read. Behind a massive mahogany desk sat Richard Avery. He was older, his hair a distinguished silver, but his eyes were the same cold, calculating gray of a winter storm. They were the eyes of a man who had ordered deaths and signed fortunes without ever losing a night's sleep. He smiled, a thin, bloodless stretching of his lips. "Miss Boone," he said, his voice as smooth as polished stone. "And Marshall McCrae. Or I should say, former Marshall McCrae. I must admit I am surprised. I had assumed my associate Mr. Pike had resolved your situation." "Your associate failed," Silas said, his voice cutting through the cloying civility of the room. Avery's smile didn't falter. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "A pity. Good help is so hard to find these days." "So you have come all this way for what? Revenge? A foolish endeavor. I am a very powerful man. This city, this territory, they belong to me." I placed the journal on his desk with a loud thud. "We came for this," I said. "For the truth." He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "That little book? My dear girl, that is your word against mine. Who do you think they will believe?" That's when Silas played our final card. "You're right," Silas said, stepping closer to the desk. "They might not believe a half-breed girl and a blind ex-lawman." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But they will believe the St. Louis Dispatch. You see, before we left Whistleben, we made a copy. Every name, every date, every stolen dollar. And we sent it to a very ambitious reporter who would love nothing more than to expose a war hero as a common thief and a murderer." Avery's smile finally vanished. A flicker of panic appeared in his cold eyes. "You're bluffing," he hissed. Silas smiled, and it was a terrifying sight. It was the smile of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Am I?" he asked. "There's a telegram office just down the street. If they don't receive a message from us by sundown, a message with a very specific code word, that story goes to print. Your empire, Avery, will turn to dust by morning." Avery stared at us, his mind racing, searching for an escape route. But there was none. We had him cornered. The gun he had tucked in his desk, the guards outside the door, they were all useless. We weren't threatening his life. We were threatening his name, his legacy, and to a man like Richard Avery, that was a fate far worse than death. He slumped back in his chair, defeated. The invincible titan of El Paso was suddenly just a small old man in an expensive suit. "What do you want?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Money? Gold?" I shook my head. "We want you to disappear," I said. "You will liquidate your assets. You will pay back every family you stole from, and then you will get on a boat and you will never set foot in this territory again." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a new kind of hatred. But he knew he had no choice. We had won. Not with bullets, but with words. With the truth. We walked out of that bank and into the bright El Paso sun. We didn't look back. We didn't need to. The story was over. It's been 2 months since that day. Silas and we found a small piece of land outside a quiet town in New Mexico. We built a little house with a wide porch that looks out over the mountains. Gospel, his old horse, grazes in the pasture. At night I read to him, not from my mother's old book of tales, but from a new journal. Our journal. We're writing our own story now. Whistlebend is where my story began, in the dust and the fear, but it's not where it ended. The truth I've learned is a funny thing. It can be buried for years, but it can't be killed. It always finds a way to the surface. It rides farther and faster than any bullet, and sometimes it takes a blind man to truly see it. If you enjoyed this story and you want to hear more tales of justice from the dusty corners of history, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and don't forget to ring the notification bell. You never know what secrets we'll dig up next.